Let me paint you a picture of what it looks like when a team has everything except the one thing that actually matters. The Detroit Lions, an NFL franchise since 1930. They have money, facilities, draft picks, talented players. What they don't have, what they've never had for more than a fleeting moment, real leadership. And for decades, the result was the same. Losing, not just losing games, losing hope, losing identity, losing belief that anything would ever change. One playoff win since 1957? Let that sink in. One playoff win in 67 years. The NFL's first 0-16 season in 2008? Yeah, that belongs to the Detroit Lions. Barry Sanders, one of the greatest running backs in NFL history, and personally I think the greatest running back ever, retiring at age 30 in his prime because he just couldn't take it anymore. Calvin Johnson, Megatron, generational talent, retiring at 30 for the exact same reason. Matt Stafford, an elite quarterback, leaving the team, also for the exact same reason. This isn't a talent problem. This is a leadership problem. And today we're going to dissect exactly what happens when there's a leadership vacuum, what it looks like, how it destroys organizations, and why Dan Campbell's arrival mattered so much. Not because he was the smartest coach or had the best resume, but because he was the first real leader that franchise has seen in generations. Here's what people don't understand about the Detroit Lions. This wasn't about lacking talent. They had Pro Bowlers, they had all pros, they drafted well at times. This was about the absence of real leadership. For people who aren't familiar with the sad and frustrating history of the Lions, it's hard to understand just how leaderless the franchise felt for decades. Let me show you what I mean. 1. Coaches managed optics, not culture. Let's walk through some of the Lions' coaching history because it's a masterclass in what not to do. Marty Mornhinweg, 2001 to 2002, 5-27 record. This is the guy who, in overtime against the Bears in 2002, won the coin toss and elected to kick, not receive. Kick. He literally gave the ball to the opposing team in sudden death. The Lions lost. That's not a strategy. That's panic. That's a guy who doesn't know what he's doing. Steve Mariucci, 2003 to 2005, 15-28 record. Mariucci came from San Francisco with a winning record and high expectations. He lasted 3 years and was fired midseason after a humiliating Thanksgiving loss. Players didn't trust him. The offense was a mess. The culture deteriorated. One former player said the locker room was relieved when he was fired. Rod Marinelli, 2006 to 2008, 10-38 record, including the 0-16 season. Marinelli was a defensive coach his whole career. The defense was supposed to be his specialty. In 2008, the Lions went 0-16, the first team in NFL history to go winless in a 16-game season. They gave up 517 points. The defense was historically bad. Marinelli was a nice guy, but he wasn't a leader. Jim Caldwell, 2014 to 2017, 36-28 record. Now Caldwell is interesting because he actually had a winning record. He went 11-5 in his first year, made the playoffs twice. But here's the thing, even with a winning record, there was no identity. Players liked him, but the culture felt soft. When things got tough, the team folded. And when new GM Bob Quinn came in, he decided Caldwell's mediocrity wasn't good enough. So he fired a coach with a winning record to hire Matt Patricia, 2018 to 2020, 13-29-1 record. Oh boy, where do I even start with Matt Patricia? Patricia came from New England with 6 Super Bowl appearances. He was the hot candidate everyone wanted. The Patriot Way was coming to Detroit, and it was an absolute freaking disaster. Here's what happened. Patricia tried to implement Belichick's harsh, no-nonsense style without the Belichick resume or respect. He publicly embarrassed veterans like Darius Slay and Glover Quinn. And after a joint practice with the Giants where Odell Beckham Jr. got the better of Slay, Patricia put together a highlight reel of Slay getting burned and showed it to the team needing to humiliate him. He implemented ridiculous rules. No photos in the locker room, no socializing with opponents after games, constant, harsh criticism without any positive reinforcement. Players described his meetings as a lot of, hey, bad job, bleep, 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 bleep. One veteran said, when Coach Patricia got here, it was, you guys are awful, I've got to change the whole culture. Another said, didn't nobody care at that point? Everybody was glad to be out of the building and done. On the final day of the 2018 season, 10 to 15 players brought champagne into the locker room, mixed it with orange juice to make mimosas, and had a party before the last team meeting, celebrating that they were finally done with Patricia. Former safety Glover Quinn said the locker room turned into a funhouse that final week because guys were over it, really. They were over the season. They were over everything. Patricia lasted less than 3 seasons. The Lions went 13-29-1. It was toxic, dysfunctional, and a complete failure. Do you see the pattern here? Coaches focused on schemes, not people. Coaches were corporate and detached. Coaches talked about accountability, toughness, and culture, but didn't live it. Coaches managed optics. They said the right things in press conferences, but there was no substance behind it. That's not leadership, that's management. And you can't manage your way to a championship culture. So, what happens when there's no real leadership? 1, losing becomes normalized. Over time, the Lions developed a quiet, dangerous disease, expectation of failure. Late game collapses felt inevitable. Under Patricia, the Lions became the first team in NFL history to blow 4 consecutive double-digit leads. Players played hard but not hopeful. Fans braced for disappointment, not success. 1 playoff win in 67 years, that doesn't happen by accident. That happens when losing becomes normalized, when there's no standard, when there's no leader demanding more. And 2, players didn't trust the message. When leadership changes every 2 to 3 years, the systems change, the expectations shift, and buy-in disappears. Players stopped committing fully because history tells them this won't last anyway. Why go all in for a coach who's going to be fired in 2 years? Why buy into a culture that's going to be demolished the moment the next guy arrives? That's not a talent issue. That's a leadership vacuum. 3 star players left or burned out. Barry Sanders retired at 30 in his prime. One of the greatest running backs ever. Why? Because he was tired of losing and saw no hope it would ever change. Calvin Johnson retired at 30. Megatron, a generational talent. Why? The same reason. Matt Stafford, who spent 12 years in Detroit and became one of the best quarterbacks in the league, was traded and immediately won a Super Bowl with the Rams. These weren't players who couldn't handle the grind. These were elite, tough, dedicated players who left because there was no real leadership, no vision, no belief that anything would ever change. I've seen this in business and it's painful. I've worked for a company that went through 3 CEOs in 5 years. Each one came in with a new vision, new strategy, new priorities. And you know what happened? No one committed. Employees stopped caring. They'll nod in their meetings, but privately say, just wait. This guy will be gone in 2 years too, and we'll just start all over again. Projects got abandoned midstream. Initiatives lost momentum. The best employees left for companies with stability and real leadership. The company had talent, resources, and opportunity. But what it didn't have was a leader who would stay, build something real, and actually live the values that they preached. Does that sound familiar? Because that was the Detroit Lions for over 60 years. Now, when Dan Campbell arrived in January 2021, he didn't promise wins. He promised who they would be. He took ownership of the pain. From day one, Campbell acknowledged how bad it had been, how hard it would be, and that shortcuts don't work. In his introductory press conference, he said, this team is going to take on the identity of this city. And this city's been down and it's found a way to get up. The team's going to be built on, we're going to kick you in the teeth. We're going to get knocked down, and on the way up, we're going to bite a kneecap off. That honesty mattered. It told players and fans, I'm not pretending this is something it isn't. Compare that to Matt Patricia, who arrived and said, there was a lot of work to do, implying the previous regime was trash, when in fact, Caldwell had just posted back-to-back winning seasons. Campbell didn't blame the past. He acknowledged it and he said, we're going to build something different. He created an identity before results. Before the Lions won consistently, they played hard late and lost seasons. 13-1 in year 1, but won 3 games down the stretch. They fought contenders when they had nothing to gain. They knocked the Packers out of the playoffs in a meaningless game, and they finished games with aggression. They never phoned it in, never quit. That's leadership building habits before headlines. Most coaches say, let's win some games, then we'll have a culture. Campbell said, let's build a culture, then the wins will follow. And he was right. He made accountability visible. Campbell owned losses publicly. Hey, it's my fault. He took the blame when decisions failed, and he never hid behind the coordinators or players. After the 0-10-1 start, Campbell didn't blame talent. He didn't blame injuries. He said, we can't fall into this trap of, well, we don't have enough talent. That's not who we are. That flipped the script. Players trusted him because he stood in front, not behind. Compare that to Patricia, who blamed players publicly, who humiliated veterans in team meetings, who created an us versus them mentality where coaches were above criticism. Campbell did the opposite, and it worked. Now, what are the results beyond the wins and losses? Well, even before the record improved, the changes were obvious. Players wanted to stay in Detroit. For the first time in decades, players were re-signing, choosing Detroit, not fleeing at the first opportunity. Free agents chose Detroit. This was unheard of for years, but suddenly, veterans were signing there because they believed in what Campbell was building. And close games stopped feeling cursed. Under Patricia, the Lions blew 4 consecutive double-digit leads. Under Campbell, they started winning these games. And fans felt pride, even in losses. At 0-10-1, the fan base didn't turn on Campbell. They believed in him because they could see he was building something real. Eventually, the wins followed. Year 1, 3-13-1. Year 2, 9-8. Year 3, 12-5. Division title, playoff wins. Year 4, 15-2, and the number 1 seed. But the wins were a symptom, not the cause. The cause was leadership. So why does this matter for non-football people? The Lions story is a leadership lesson, not a sports one. For decades, Detroit had strategy. They had smart schemes, good coordinators. They had talent. They had Pro Bowlers, All-Pros, high draft picks, and they had resources. They had the money, the facilities, and the support. What they lacked was someone willing to absorb responsibility, set a real standard, model the behavior, and stay when it was uncomfortable. Dan Campbell didn't fix the Lions by being smarter than everyone else. He fixed them by being real, by saying, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, and I'm going to live it every single day. And players responded, because finally, for the first time in generations, someone was actually leading. The Detroit Lions weren't bad because they lacked players. They were bad because no one truly led them. For 60 years, they had coaches, managers, tacticians, and corporate spokespeople. What they didn't have was a leader. Dan Campbell changed that by choosing the hard path, refusing to tank, and having demanding standards even at 0-10-1. He was living the standard, doing burpees with the team, taking public blame, working till 3:30 a.m. to midnight. And he was making belief believable, not through speeches, but through his actions. And for the first time in generations, the Detroit Lions stopped hoping for leadership and finally had it. The lesson isn't about football. It's about what happens when there's a leadership vacuum and what changes when someone finally steps into that void and says, follow me, I'll show you the way. That's what real leadership looks like.